Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last session of this marathon week of the 2021 Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. This year's summit is being held during International Compost Awareness Week, the largest and most comprehensive education initiative of the compost industry. And this year's theme is Grow, Eat, Compost, Repeat. For those who might not know me, although I think pretty much after this week, all of you do, but I am Natasha Duarte, Director of the Composting Association of Vermont. Huge thank you to all of our amazing sponsors of this virtual summit. These include Community Bank, Eco Products, Vermont Natural Ag Products, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, AgriLab Technologies, Inc., EcoPixel, Nature Cycle, the Vermont Produce Program from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and the Eco-AmeriCorps program from the Department of Environmental Conservation. So it would be super difficult for us to pull off a week-long summit without their support. And so just really genuine, sincere, big thanks to all of those folks for supporting us. Before we move into the virtual tour, I just have two announcements I'd like to make. At VORS during this week, the Composting Association of Vermont is also launching a new education and outreach initiative, which is a multi-generational statewide art challenge called Changing Lives Through Compost, One Scrap at a Time. This project stemmed from some work I did with two CAV members, Paul and Winsong Kervick, who find beauty in everything they see, but especially their food scraps as they go into their countertop food scrap bucket. And they would take pictures as they went along and had this great catalog of all of these pictures and approached me with this idea of doing a calendar. So I worked with them to create a food scrap story calendar featuring those photographs. And we sent those out as a year-end campaign. Thank you gift and for folks who are joining, new members of the association. And one ended up on the wall of someone whose 4-year-old granddaughter, Neoma, saw it and wanted to do her own version of food scrap art. And they then emailed us these great pictures of art. And so that sort of is where the seed for this idea came from. Since then, I've gotten lots of project partners on board to help us promote it. I have a dedicated volunteer who's going to help me organize it all. And you can learn more at compostingvermont.org/foodscrapart. All submissions are going to be featured on the CAV website, and then some will be selected for a 2022 calendar. And so I just encourage you to reach out to me directly if you want to become a partner, or if you want some more materials to take into your classrooms or in your communities. We'd love to have you participate in this initiative. Our virtual tour today is with Black Dirt Farm. Tom Gilbert is on hand, and we're going to start today's session by watching a 13-minute video, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion afterwards. And so let me just switch what I'm sharing here. All right.
Hi, I'm Thea.
And I'm Ava.
And I'm Toby.
We're going to be the directors
of this farm tour. Enjoy!
Hey, welcome. I'm Tom, and this is Black Dirt Farm, and we're going to take a little walk around. The farm is designed after the carbon cycle and is a series of dovetailed businesses that flow value from one to the next, following the energy cycle. And we'll just go pop around and see each one a little bit. But for a quick overview, basically we go off of the farm, we collect discarded food from restaurants, grocery stores, and other institutions in the community. And then we bring it back here, we blend it up into a compost mix, we forage laying hens on that, and then we make compost with what they don't eat. We make worm castings with a portion of that, and then we grow crops on the back end. So as part of our collection operations, we go off the farm and service about 80 and 90 schools and businesses and food-based institutions. We deliver about 40% of that or less, maybe 25 now, to other locations, Lamoille Soil in Hyde Park and Tamerlane Farm in Lindenville. And then we bring the majority of the material back here where we blend it up into a forage for the hens. And we can look at the compost equipment, the collection equipment. A load just came in, and this is what the load looks like. So we collect from a diversity of generators, from food folks making prepared food to industrial food processors, and when we have the material come in, we have a bed of carbon material that we receive the load on, and then we blend the material up once it's here with our hot mix. So we collect food scraps in 48-gallon totes, and we use a hydraulic candy cane lifter to pick the containers up and tip into the trailer. It's a sealed body trailer so that it doesn't leak. And then we carry in the back of the truck water for washing the containers with, and a hot water pressure washer so that the operator can stand on the generator box and wash the containers out while they're inverted. And then we collect the wash water and leave clean totes. So we raise about 1,000 laying hens here, house them in this double-walled greenhouse, and forage them on compost, which we'll show you outside. So we're now on the compost site, and this is where we bring material after the hens forage on it and build a pile out here. So the material starts on the north end of our pad and then is turned with the loader or the tractor in a staggered parallel system and moves its way south through the composting process. Piles are turned based on temperature, moisture, and other just logistical factors. The other materials coming onto the farm or coming out of the barn come over here, so we receive wood chip here. And then we have a covered area where we handle manures, and in the back right corner, blend the manures into a hot mix that's already pre-composting before we blend it with the food scraps. And the covers help us keep moisture off of those materials, but then also make sure that we're not letting free nutrients migrate into any water. The whole site drains towards the hayfield, right through there. And in here, this other hoop barn is where we store finished product, or dry it and prepare it for screening. And then in the final stage of things, we screen over here. Finished piles that are no longer heating, we do our best to cover, keep weed seeds and pathogens at bay. And material is screened through this little Sittler trommel screen. And for us, since we've got this sort of mixed operation, we end up having to truck to our retail area, so we screen right into the bed of a dump truck and then bring it up to our retail area. That it's all cleared out right now, up by the road where we load trucks. So welcome to the worm shed. This is where we make worm castings. This is a continuous flow worm bin that's designed to work with epigeic worms. We use Acenia fetida, or red wigglers, and bins 2 feet deep. They're surface feeders, so they're always coming up to the top, and we feed from the top, and then we harvest from the bottom. A little hard to see with the camera, but happy worms are up on the surface. That means our moisture's right. And then on the bottom of this thing is a grate. The material falls through there when we pull a cutting bar with a motor. There's a motor on the far end, and then there's a cutting bar that rides on this rail and is on a looped cable, and it drops the material through the bottom, and then we dry it on the floor, and then we prepare it for screening, and we screen it through this little electric trommel screen, and we pull off several different grades from the trommel screen. And then we have a bagging area on the far end where we just bag manually with a stitcher and prepare pallets to go out, or in this case a sling sack to head out to a vegetable grower. So in addition to the other businesses that we have, we grow some limited crops, and where the compost ties into that, aside from building soil, is recovering some heat and pumping some heat into the greenhouse. So we're back where we started earlier, where the hens are foraging on this aerated static pile. It's a little hard to see, but the base of this is got hemlock air channels built into the ground in a grid, with perforations and we put down a 12-inch bed of wood chip on the bottom, and then stack the mix on the top of that, and then we use fans to pull warm air into the greenhouse. So our whole heat recovery system is pretty bootstrap and pretty inefficient compared to some of the really great systems and technologies on the market, like the AgriLab systems. But our system, the wood channels go to these PVC channels back here that tie into these biofilters. You can see the far one down at the end here. So we have 2 cells. They each go to their own biofilter. These big wood boxes are like giant septic tanks, and we have baffles in them that make the air move in a serpentine pattern, and then they're being pulled, the air is being pulled through by these fans on the end, and right now we just simply dump that warm air into the greenhouse, which is probably the least efficient way that we could deliver heat right now, but it's prototype construction along the way. And the wood chip in the biofilters, it's absorbing ammonia and helping the moisture to settle out, so we're not just dumping a bunch of moisture and ammonia into the greenhouse, but just heat and carbon dioxide. For me, the farm is not just an enterprise, and it's really a tool for shifting the systems that our communities and our society at large rely on. And so we really think of the farm as having a lot of social responsibility. So we are not looking to be the biggest operation around. We're not looking to dominate the space. We're looking to deliver extremely exceptionally high quality products and services, but also really we're looking at a multiple bottom line and tracking other metrics like our carbon use and where we source our own inputs here, not only feedstocks, but other things like choosing to buy things locally and pay an additional fee for that. And, how to utilize the farm as a platform for achieving larger social outcomes. And that a lot of that comes through the relationships that we have with other operators and with the municipalities. Among other things, we are able to utilize our products, especially our eggs, for social messaging. And so we really try to utilize all of the platforms of the farm to exercise things greater than just having a cool regenerative business.
All right, thank you. So that was a little taste, having had the pleasure of having a farm tour with Tom. That kind of gives you the sense of walking around, of course, without the chit chat and questions as we go. But Tom, I'd like to just open it up to you. Thanks for sharing your video. If you want to unmute and just maybe make some comments, and folks, if you have questions, you want to type into chat or let me know that you'd like to be unmuted, and we can just sort of move into Q&A and conversation.
Hey, this is funny not being able to see anybody, but I'm excited to do this, and I really appreciate Natasha's help. Natasha's got some her fingers in the editing of the video to help make that all come together. So I have a lot of gratitude for her help. But it's I think that Vermont is an exciting place to be doing business, and I think the universal recycling law is an incredible tool for us to reintegrate the food system into the image of an ecosystem, and we're just simply trying to design and operate our business in right relationship with our community and our customers and our vendors and everybody that we engage with. So I don't have a whole lot prepared. I think if we just jumped into Q&A, that would be the most fun, and we can kind of see where the conversation goes from there.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I would, you guys, if you want to share your webcams now, just sometimes with the video and people with their webcams with Vermont's internet, it can get a little shaky. But now that that's through, feel free to share your videos as well. Hey, Brian. So we do have a couple questions coming in for chat, and I'll just read those out for everybody. So Ellen would like to know what the ideal temperature is for your worms, Tom.
I think that 80 is a really nice temperature. They thrive between 70 and 85. They can tolerate well below 70. Below 50, they really stop being very active. They'll survive. And over 85, then they quickly start running for the hills. So I shoot for about 80. And ideally, they'd have like 70% moisture.
And you heat that your worm shed in the wintertime, or is there enough heat generated?
Yeah. Nope. We do have, it's a radiant slab, and then we actually run radiant tubing in the bin itself. So the bin is our primary cell for any sort of radiant geeks out there. And so that's really what we're maintaining temperature on. We use propane to heat hot water. And then the material that we do bring in also does bring in some supplemental heat, but it's primarily heated with propane.
Great, thank you. And we're gonna take another worm question first and then jump to some of the other ones. So Abigail would like to know, with that large of a system for worms, do you just continue to let them grow and reproduce without taking them out and starting over? She's curious how a continually running system works, as opposed to what some of us might be more familiar with, like a home kind of scale worm system. So maybe you could explain just a little bit more about how that system works at the scale that you're operating.
Sure. Yeah, and just to say it is possible. There are continuous flow residential systems out there that somebody could use that would eliminate the need for separating worms and castings and having multiple containers for multiple batches. So I really like the continuous flow system. It allows us to, be efficient. We don't mess around with the population. We raised up. We started with 25 pounds of worms and raised up, and we probably have about 300 to 400 pounds of worms in there at this point. And the population is somewhat self-stabilizing. So we don't intentionally take worms out of there. We don't sell worms either. We give worms away mostly to, a neighbor that wants to start their own home bin, or a science teacher that wants a small bin in their classroom. But we lose some worms through the bottom on occasion, and then they basically govern their own population just through resource availability. So it's not something we actively manage. We focus more on making sure they seem like they're thriving.
Great, thank you. We have a couple questions, switching now to the food scrap sources that you bring onto the farm. We have a couple questions about contaminants. How you deal with them. This question, Larry, I'm not sure I entirely understand. He wrote, do you have requirements of what gets in the food scrap? So like, are there things that you don't take specifically because of the system you're integrating them into?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So we have a lot of things that we don't take. Especially things that are not compostable. That's our main focus. So we take any form of organic matter that isn't adulterated with something else. So we'll take bones, we'll take shells. We obviously take your typical food scraps, but we're happy to take meat, fish, dairy. We get some food processing materials that are kind of unique. We get niter, which is diatomaceous earth that's used for filtering maple syrup. And that was those filters that you saw in the video. And it's basically diatomaceous earth caked with sugar and all sorts of micronutrients. But we take, grocery stores and schools, and our biggest goal is really just making sure that we're not getting plastics in there or other contaminants. But we're most worried about plastics more than, say, metals. And for the plastics and all other non-organic materials, we really focus on prevention and mitigation as much as we can. So if you come into our program, you sign a contract with us that specifies all of the terms and conditions. We send a trainer out and we train your staff. We don't let you train your own staff. Same thing with schools. We go in and we train the schools. And we really try to develop a rapport directly with the folks that are stewarding the resource and doing that separating. And in Vermont, we have a law that requires the separation of food scraps from other materials, and really the only effective tool to keep people effectively source separating material is to go in and do face-to-face training. So signage is great, other information is great, but we really focus on the human relationship side of it and really helping folks, one, see the value in what they're doing so that it's meaningful to them, but also that they can have like a psychological closeness to it that helps them, really assign meaning to it. But beyond that too, that they need to know there's humans on the other side of this, and so we specifically, use our drivers by name. We send out emails to our customers to, introduce a new driver. We try to make it really personal so that people can imagine that if they don't do a good job separating, one of us is going to have to wade through something that they probably wouldn't want to wade through to pick that out. And we have really, really good outcomes. And I've been doing this for about 25 years. And I would say, the idea that source separation just isn't plausible is just so pessimistic. I just really feel like most people, they really do want to do a good job and that they want to do right by things. So we really focus on not getting those materials. But the other thing and then actually just to finish on the food scraps, we also then pick. So our drivers, when they show up at a stop, they go through as much of the top of the material as they can in the container. If it looks clean, then they tip it. If it doesn't look clean, then we have a rubric that we go through to kind of determine whether we're going to leave it for them to deal with or whether we're going to deal with it. We almost never reject totes. We probably reject 1 or 2 a year. And that would be extreme. Like there's a bunch of broken glass in there that we're never going to pick out, or a bunch of crushed styrofoam or something very hard to extract, or some indication that there's a toxin in there, though I've never run into that. Mm-hmm. And then we take pictures if we find contaminants. We go back to our contact with the generator. We share those pictures with them. We are very focused on being collaborative. And so if somebody's staff is really struggling and week after week we're having a problem, then we go right back in free of charge and provide a training. And then at a certain point, if we're just not getting responsiveness, we do have the ability to levy a fee in our contract. And we do that, but it's really a last resort. The last thing we want to do is be turning people off from what we do. On the other materials, we are really careful about other materials we bring in as to manures and hay and other such. So we don't import any hay off of our farm. We grow all of our own hay for the hay portion of the mix. If you're sourcing hay from elsewhere, you would want to make certain that it's not grown with persistent herbicides. And that's particularly hard if you're bringing stuff in over the border, say from Canada. Horse manure, we generally just use our own, but if we are bringing in horse manure from another location, we make certain that horse is either fed entirely on grass that's not grown with herbicides or organic grain, just because, again, of the persistent herbicide issue. And with dairy manure, our biggest concern for contaminants is antibiotics. And antibiotics generally are shown to break down during the composting process. But because we forage our laying hens on there, we're particularly sensitive to it. And so we only partner with farms that we know we can count on to exclude manure that might have antibiotics in it from it. And we do occasional testing on that to just also have the confidence in what we've got. But we do our best to source most of our materials from within our own grasp and really know what we've got. Mostly it's wood chip and a neighboring farm's dairy manure that we bring in. Everything else we generate ourselves or handle ourselves.
Great, thank you. And you answered with that a couple of the other questions. So we're gonna hop back to the worms. There's a question about what you feed the worms. Is it the compost or manure, or what is that material that you're putting on there for them?
We feed the compost, and we actually feed compost from 2 different stages of the composting process. So one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time in my research over the last decade plus in this is trying to figure out what the optimum point in the composting life cycle is for feeding the worms on, so that you get the soil building product at the end that you want. And so the point. So our recipe, the most important thing is that the initial recipe that the compost is made out of influences kind of everything that happens thereafter. So our mix is about a baseline of 11, but up to 13 different ingredients. And our focus is on the energy spectrum. So we have at least 7 different energy sources, ranging from simple sugars and then moving in a spectrum to the more complex lignin-based, like hardwood bark, with things like paper and hay and such, sawdust, wood chip along the way. And then the question with the worms is, at what point in the composting process do we pull it out? And we actually have sort of landed on providing them a blend of mature compost and compost that's still in process but has met the PFRP requirements. And we use our finished castings testing. We do a lot of biological testing. So we look a lot at what our biological community is in the finished product, and that gives us the feedback for how we might intervene in the feeding system back upstream.
Great, thank you. We have a bunch of other questions, but I'm going to sort of jump off of the idea of what you feed worms to ask you to address a little bit about how the chickens are integrated and what you feed them. I know just from a number of community composting sites that I work at that are trying to integrate laying hens, there's this concept that I'm kind of always struggling with of like, put food scraps out and then take them away and don't like, the chickens aren't fully integrated into the system. And so I wanted you to just touch on that briefly about how you manage that on your farm.
Yep. Yeah, I would say, there are a number of other folks that are foraging hens on compost, and we do it, everybody does it differently, obviously. And I'll describe how we do it. But in terms of like full access to the compost life cycle, places like Vermont Compost Company have a very different program. And I really appreciate about theirs is their birds are up where they're turning piles, whereas our birds are not on our compost site, partly because I don't quite understand how to control pathogens in that scenario. But so our birds have right now access to a certain portion of the compost life cycle. That aerated static pile that you saw in the video, basically we start out with that being, somewhat full, and then each day kind of layer on top of that. And so that we're putting down material that is heated. So we're into the PFRP process, so that we're not introducing pathogens to them. We are bringing in, implicit in what we do is this sort of dualism of trying to create a very local food system, but also bringing in materials from the industrial food system. And that's this dichotomy that it can be hard to square, and I can appreciate that. And so we do what we can to sort of mitigate the challenges or the concerns with that. And one thing is making sure that material is actively composting. It's at 140 degrees when we feed it to the hens. And they're a little standoffish when it's 140, but it doesn't take too long for them to cool down. And then they just keep having access to that. And then eventually we pull that out and swap it out. We're about to go to a different system where we integrate the use of some dumpsters in that model too, so that we can extend the portion of the compost life cycle that the birds have access to.
Great, thank you.
One thing with your piece, Natasha, specifically is throwing them food scraps is different than foraging them on compost. I think that's an important clarification. So what we do and what most of the commercial farms that you might hear of using the practice, we're really foraging them on active compost and not just throwing food scraps at them. And the big difference is, one, we have that heating happening so that we are containing pathogens. We are getting some antibiotic breakdown if there's antibiotics present. But the other thing that we're doing is we're taking that apple, which has nutrition, but it has a limited amount of nutrition, and we're growing bacteria all over it. So when the hen is pecking at the apple, she's getting a lot of other protein. And that's how a lot of animals that eat carrion, vultures, bald eagles, wild dogs, animals that eat each other's manure, like really what they're doing is they're harvesting bacteria and they're getting bacterial protein. And the Indonesian red jungle fowl, where all domestic chickens come from, they're detritivores in ecological terms. They forage the decomposer system. And so a lot of what they're eating is not the oil palm fruit from the tree, but the oil palm fruit that's hit the ground, started to ferment, and is starting to decompose. And that's what they're eating.
Great, thank you. So a bunch of questions have come in while we're chatting. I'm just going to run through some of them. So there's a question about diatomaceous earth, and is that considered a green material? And how would a lot of that affect a compost pile? They have a lot of the syrup filters each spring. So just trying to look for how they might integrate that maybe.
Great. Yeah, the whole brown and green thing starts becoming kind of cumbersome when you start dealing with larger volumes of material and recipes, because as the person in the question is recognizing, there's this, it's kind of in this gray area actually. So it feels like when you're handling it, what you might call a green material, and that it's wet and heavy and dense, which is what most of the green materials are compared to, say, brown materials, the carbon materials. But all that sugar is carbon. So it ultimately acts as a carbon source, as what somebody might call it brown material. And it is brown, actually. So it's a combination of the filters, which themselves are a carbon source, and then the DE with the filter cake in it. And I guess the one thing that I would sort of mention in terms of integrating that into composting is that it's very high in calcium, and that's wonderful. That's actually part of, I think, what makes, we have an extremely high calcium, magnesium, potassium profile compared to other products out there. And I think a lot of it is in part due to that. But the flip side is you can send your pH through the roof really fast. So we also run a little bit on the high side on pH, not terrible. But you can also slow down and mess up your composting process if you send your pH too high. And then the filters themselves are a little bit tricky just because they really do need heat and agitation to break down. Otherwise, they tend to sit around. If there's like on the outside of the pile, they don't tend to decompose. So they really need agitation and active composting.
Great, thank you. Another question from Brian. Do you find any leachate coming from the flow through the worm bin? And if not, can you explain why not?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is we have, and we still do on occasion, but that is, one of the first things when we're training somebody is that's feedback that we overwatered. And so the biggest thing is what we've come to appreciate is, and that's, you might have seen the Wobbler head sprinkler system above the worm bin. So we've shifted to using Wobbler heads, and instead of the operator spraying with a wand, one, it's just more time efficient, but two, operators get a little distracted or they just stop moving their hand, and it doesn't take long for preferential flows to create and then end up down on the ground. And so we go with short and sweet. So we really run the Wobbler heads for like 3 minutes at a time. And ideally we would do it like twice a day, but at least once. It's somewhat seasonal. So in the summer, we have to water them more. Spring and fall, we water them the least. Winter, it's drier in there too, because we've got heat on. So, and that is just a fine balance of just paying attention to the system, because it's tricky. Like everything we do, as I'm sure everybody here does, but especially in the worm shed and in the layer barn, is many of our goals are sort of not necessarily like diabolically opposed per se, but they're in tension with one another. And so what the worms want up in where they're operating and what we want down below in the bin are not actually the same thing, because we don't want the castings to go anaerobic. And if you saturate the top too much, that lower section of the bin will start getting anaerobic, and it will be hard to harvest. So it's just spending a lot of time observing and just digging in there and figuring out where the wetting front is within the profile of the bin, and really focusing on giving them just enough, but not too much. It's kind of, I wish I could offer something more specific, but that's kind of how it goes.
Hands-on training. Great, thank you. And then we have another question. Is horse deworming medication okay in the manure for composting? How is the deworming stuff considered?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a perfect answer on it. And so when I don't have an answer, we tend to use the precautionary principle. So when we do worm our horses here, but we just spread that manure in the grass where it doesn't enter our composting system for 3 days afterwards. And or I wouldn't mind putting it on a hayfield per se. Mm-hmm. Most dewormers, I think, do break down during the composting process. But I have seen plenty of horse manure batches, especially when I was composting elsewhere and didn't have horses here and was bringing in other people's manure, like stables that tend to deworm all the time and use a lot of dewormer. I have seen those piles refuse to heat, and basically not necessarily kill the composting process, but pretty radically delay it. So at this point, we just figure it's twice a year and for 3 days, and we just exclude that manure.
Great, thank you. Larry would like to know if your eggs are available in the Burlington area.
Oh, Burlington. Yeah, no, we don't get into Burlington right now. Closest to Burlington would be probably Roots Market in, I guess those guys are technically in Waterbury, but it could be Moortown there, I guess. So yeah, we do mostly northern and central Vermont, and then ship through farmers to you into Boston.
Great, thank you.
But if anybody here works at a city market and you want to win our the portion that we send to Boston, give me a call.
Well, City Market actually reached out to me before the summit saying that they were sharing the summit as for their volunteers, and they were really encouraging their members and staff to participate in the summit. So who knows, Tom, maybe ears will perk up and we'll be able to purchase your eggs at City Market. Or maybe we can all just go and drop in the suggestion box that they have. Then,
yeah, there you go.
We want Tom's eggs.
You can get our compost and worm castings at City Market.
Okay.
And castings are at Green State and Gardner Supply and pretty well distributed through Burlington or in Chittenden County.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Any other questions from folks? So here we go. Brian Jarosz would like to know what your proportion of windrow compost sold versus vermicompost.
Oh, the castings are a fraction of the compost. So they're less than 5%.
Oh, all right.
So it's, it just takes so much more work per unit, and our system is pretty small right now, but yeah, it's probably about 5%. Yeah. And if there aren't any more questions, I guess I might just take 2 seconds, since we have till 4, to just talk a little bit about the universal recycling law. I think people have been asking questions about separation, and if you're not sort of tracking how things are going with the law, we have a really exciting law in Vermont that most of you are probably familiar with, just at least in concept. It's probably the most ambitious recycling legislation in the country, and there's lots of other states that are following along in Vermont's footsteps and utilizing some aspects, not in most cases, not all aspects of our law. And one of the things that is the most part of the reason that the Vermont law is so exciting is not only that it's ambitious, but it's also was designed to be very rigorous. And we are having some problems in Vermont with the state relaxing requirements for separating food materials or food scraps from contaminants. And this is an issue I think that really does require public attention right now, because microplastics are a very real thing. And if you're getting compost from a facility that either is accepting non-source separated material and has a lot of plastic coming into it, you will be getting plastic in your compost, and it will be going into your soil. And increasingly, there's just papers coming out like almost weekly right now on how those microplastics are destabilizing soil aggregates, how they migrate out of our gardens and farmland into waterways. They're now documenting huge volumes of plastic leaving farmland and going into water systems. And we're all freaking out about plastics in the ocean, but they don't get there sort of by accident and on their own. And we have water systems, freshwater systems, that we need to steward and care for. And I think right now, unfortunately, the Vermont consumer is very unaware of the amount of plastic going into certain operations, and the need for the state to take a leadership role in regulating that. And we now have allowed in depackaging facilities that are not being required to keep packaging separate from food scraps at all, and are processing these things together and guaranteed to have microplastics in them. So these are pretty hot button issue. And if you're attending because you really care about agricultural soil and local food systems, it's probably something that's worth paying attention to. And if there was, I think we have another 10 minutes. If there's any questions about it, I'd be happy to answer any other questions. But if there is any questions about that anybody wants to have, we could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll just add that coincidentally from my point of view, a week ago Friday on NPR's Science Friday, I only was able to catch parts of it. And with VORS this week, I haven't had a chance yet to go back and listen to the whole thing, but they actually had a researcher who has her career is focused on microplastics. I don't know if you, Tom, caught that.
I didn't know, yeah.
But it just, because we've been having this conversation, and then I just happened to be in the car and flipped on NPR, and I was like, wait, they're talking about microplastics, and then also some of the alternative compostable plastic alternatives or compostable packaging alternatives. But the one that was highlighted that I hadn't heard anything about that's coming out of Canada is using the separated oil from fishery waste to make like a film plastic that breaks down in like freshwater, soil, so this is really at the forefront. But just to your point, Tom, I think that there's a real growing awareness of this issue, a real awareness of what we don't know, and a need to exercise that precautionary principle that you mentioned before in terms of just how we manage all materials, right? And but I also think that with this growing sense and awareness and understanding of healthy soil and or soil health and the connection to water quality, that's also pushing some pretty, maybe it's not all new, but alternatives to some of the compostable plastics that are causing other issues because of the lookalikes, and they don't only break down in certain scenarios. And so I think that we're sort of on the verge of, I guess I'm feeling hopeful that a lot more people are starting to pay attention to this, and some research, feels a little bit more collective in terms of, brains coming together to think this through and come up with viable solutions, if not how to use cropland to grow corn or different things to then make a plastic from, but to utilize a waste product that we already need to manage to serve some of the function that in our culture we can't quite figure out how to live without yet.
Yeah.
So
I think that's all really exciting, and I think that innovation is a powerful tool to design our way out of some of our problems. I also think that we have many problems, and microplastics is only one of them. And behavior change is really the key. If we focus on the technological solutions or even the to like one problem, we actually don't really do a good job then applying it to other things in terms of our behaviors. But if we learn behavior change and we learn how to steward resources and we learn how to implement sort of self-responsibility in the system, then we do apply it. So one of the things, like after we've pick up a new business, I constantly hear from the business owner, who often is kind of in a negative attitude about their employees' ability to source separate. And first of all, their employees typically do a great job. The owner is typically surprised. And then they'll tell us that, wow, our recycling rates have increased. And we get that feedback really consistently. And I think part of it is nobody went in and trained them on recycling. The idea is that's well understood right now. But I think there's something contagious about being acknowledged as a thoughtful person and having somebody try to achieve your buy-in. And suddenly people, I think, start being more aware and self-aware, and they behave more thoughtfully. And if we have any chance of dealing with the massive issues that we face, whether it's climate change or something like white supremacy, we have to begin to learn these practices. It's just like a friend of mine talks about, really understanding how to deal with race is like, you need to go to a CPR class to learn CPR. You don't just like organically learn how to address white supremacy in society. We have to actually practice these things. We have to build skills. And I think it's the same thing with source separation. We have to build skills and practice it. And if we design our way out of these things, or if we rely on the idea that we can, we're less likely to be prepared for consuming less energy when it comes to fighting global warming. And And I think we're at a moment in time where we have to potentially realize that now is different than it was in the past. 50 years ago, we could sort of maybe, or we thought we could deal with single issue things. Now we have to sort of take a more dynamic and sort of intensive approach to how we operate. And I think at a community level, really stewarding resources and being able to separate them is a pretty, it's a good practice for us to get into.
Yeah, and I think that echoes, and anyone else feel free to jump in. And okay, so Jason says, I think it's pretty clear that we need food packaging to be biodegradable and made of food, like the fish oil technology, and that any plastic that is disposable should at least not be toxic. That seems like a pretty simple first bar. Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm hearing, sort of have been hearing throughout the week that of the VOR's sessions has been this sort of continuously coming back, almost regardless of the topic of the session, to the importance of communication and relationship building and helping people understand. I mean, this just came up really significantly, I thought, in the Haulers Roundtable at 1:00 earlier today. The importance of establishing those relationships and helping connect those dots to people, that it's not just you put it somewhere, whether it's organics to be hauled away or trash or recycling, and it just goes away and someone else deals with it. But like you were saying, Tom, John's going to have to figure this out if you don't take the responsibility for it, helping us understand that there are people on the end of that system. And I think as well, one of the things that I really appreciate about how you manage and work with the customers that you haul for, Tom, is that you recognize that there's an iterative nature to it. It's unfortunately not a one and done. We can't just go in and do our spiel and hand them a poster and walk away. And even people who are maybe really trying, or there's a staff turnover or whatever it is, I think we all need to really remember that it's not about so much calling people out for missteps. It's about figuring out how we can call them in. Mm-hmm. How can we bring them along this trip with us to more responsible resource stewardship? Yep.
Yeah, I think one of the most challenging and concerning things with sort of the ubiquitous application of depackaging technology is we have a lot of people who go to work at grocery stores. And if they are seeing packaging and food going into the same container there, then when they go home and they're dropping it into a residential drop-off at a municipal recycling facility, it's too incongruous for people to understand, we can commingle organics over here, but we can't over there. Mm-hmm. And interesting, one of the things that I love is I actually see a lot of the employees we were talking about the niter before. We get a lot from Butternut Mountain Farm or Maple Grove. And, I see those employees at our residential drop-off locations, and they're participating in separation at work and at home. And if we start making different standards for those things, it gets complicated. And then just quickly to the biodegradable packaging thing, I agree, but we're not there yet. So in the meantime, we need to operate from the place that we're in. And the other part, though, is, and this is a great solution. The biodegradable stuff, I hope the fish oil comes along, but, there's PFAS in a lot of these products. And so we keep thinking that we can engineer our way out of it. But I think really we have to, even if we engineer our way forward, it does not mean that we get to disregard the principles of ecology. And that is the rule for getting to live on this earth, is that you abide by ecology. And so whatever we do, hopefully we get innovative, but it still needs to be within the boundaries of ecology. And if it takes PFAS to produce a biodegradable packaging product, I'm not really sure what the benefit is. It's still a lot of energy, and it's a toxic contaminant. And everybody's shocked that there's PFAS showing up in all this compost all over the place right now. And that we're wrapping our food in it every day. The hamburger that you get, it's covered. I knew a guy that did, it was actually my uncle does delivery to convenience stores, and they are instructed to wear gloves when handling packaged food, because for workers that handle these things, a lot of those chemicals actually add up, and there's a health risk. That's how much toxicity is on the shelves at the convenience store. That's we have a pretty high tolerance for toxicity. That's pretty concerning. But that's sort of how we've chosen to operate, and I think we just need to reorient our goals so that we can realign how we go forward regulatory wise, but also on personal behavior.
Yeah, I agree. And just to pick up that PFAS thread really quickly, at last year's summit, and I mentioned this because the recording is available for people who want to dig in a little bit. We did have a session on contaminants, emerging contaminants of concern in compost, and really trying to shift that conversation, because people, you're right, Tom, people are like, oh my gosh, this compost facility, it's contaminated, but it's like it's the composting process's fault. Like, we need to shift that to looking upstream and like, where is this coming from, and how do the decisions we make, often for convenience in our daily lives, filter all the way through? Because I can assure you, composting by its very nature does not produce PFAS. That's coming from feedstocks.
Yeah.
So, well, we are right at the top of the hour. So thank you all for hanging in for some of this other conversation. And thank you so much, Tom, for taking the time to do that video clips and sharing that with us. I hope that we can at some point have maybe some in-person tours, which would be lovely. We're hopefully moving in that direction. But again, thank you to all of the participants for participating throughout this whole week of the program for the Vermont Organics Recycling Summit. Everything will be posted. It's going to take me a couple weeks. And just a final reminder, in a little bit, you all will be getting a link via email for an online evaluation of the summit. You can just take a few minutes to fill that out. It's short, I promise. And we really do value all of your feedback that you can give. And like Larry had a suggestion for a topic for next year's summit. And that's one of the questions. What topics would you like to hear? What can we bring in to keep this program really robust and interesting? And so with that, I'm going to conclude VORS. Thank you so much for helping make it a huge success this year, the 15th. And have a wonderful weekend, everybody. And
nice
happy
work.
Mother's Day for any mothers out there coming right up. Take care, and thanks so much.